Greetings and salutations. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of One Question for Every Fight here on the SevereMMA YouTube page. I'm your host, Spencer Kyte, friendly neighborhood Spencer man, and we are going to discuss UFC 286. Takes place on Saturday at the O2 Arena in London. Third trip to London in 12 months, 13 months, I guess you do the math, month to month. And it's headlined by a big one. Trilogy fight between Leon Edwards and Kamaru Usman. A fight that has all kinds of questions hovering around it, has captivated me in the last couple of days as I've started to really dig into it. And we're going to just jump right in. As always, we're going to go top to bottom, main event through to the opener. So we start with Edwards and Usman, the trilogy fight, the championship rematch, the immediate rematch. And the question here for me is, how does the knockout factor in? I talked to Leon Edwards on Tuesday and said, how do you, as now the champion that had that moment, set that aside and move forward and make it about more than just that? And he gave me a great answer. Story will be up on UFC.com by the time you watch this, so please go check it out. But the thing that both he and I and myself and Eric Nixick and Sean Madden, who I had as guests on the coach conversation, also available on UFC.com at present. Please go check that out in my Twitter timeline as well. The thing that both of them said and that Edwards said, and that really is the thing that hangs over this, is how does Kamaru Usman deal with that knockout? Because it's one thing to be Leon Edwards and have landed that kick and be bolstered by the confidence of, I know I can land that kick because I've done it. And I've done it in a performance that was arguably my worst in the UFC up until that point. And yet I'm still able to pull that out and win the welterweight title. But Kamaru Usman had been so good and so dominant and so untested in some regards, and through 3.5 rounds, almost 4 full rounds of that fight after losing the first round, to then get put out in a fashion that he's had to have seen now hundreds of times. What does that do to you? The other piece of this for me is that Kamaru Usman is a 35-year-old man. He's not a guy that is, still 32, 33, where the miles aren't there. And we're not starting to talk about a little bit of, listen, 35 is still young. I wish I was back to being 35. I got 9 years on the former champion. But in MMA years, in competitor years, 35 is starting to get up there. It's starting to reach that point where most athletes are on the downside of things. And so between the knockout and that, is he just a little bit gun shy on Saturday night? Is there a little bit of hesitation? Because I know now that this guy's got that in his back pocket. And if he needs to, he can pull it out. And I got to be wary of it. Does it cause him to be just that half second off from where he was earlier in that fight, earlier throughout that fight, to where he was dominating things and appeared to have broken Leon Edwards right up until he proved John Anik correct, that he is not cut from that sort of cloth to quit, and bangs home that head kick that changes things in the welterweight division, drops Kamaru Usman from the pound for pound, top of the pound for pound list, to where he's now number 5, drops him out of the greatest welterweight of all time conversation that was really starting to gain momentum and gain steam. Can he now bounce back from what is a big, gnarly finish to reclaim the title that he held for a number of years? Leon Edwards has never had to deal with a knockout loss. His loss to Usman earlier in their first fight, way back December 15th, 2015, is by decision. And he can tell himself, he could have told himself going into that last fight in Salt Lake City, look, that was years ago. He just out wrestled me. I'm a much better fighter. And we saw that at UFC 278. What's the rebuttal for Kamaru Usman here? What's the self-talk for Kamaru Usman here? If it's, hey, I just got caught and these things happen, well, you better be careful because you can get caught again. Leon Edwards is going to throw that high kick. He's going to make that read and look for that shot again. I guarantee it. If it were me, I'd throw it real early, just as a little reminder, as a little flashback of, hey, remember this? To put that memory back in his head. And so I want to see how that knockout, how that head kick, how that highlight that we've all seen hundreds of times now, and Kamaru Usman has had to see hundreds of times now, impacts his performance on Saturday. Next up, co-main event in the lightweight division, Justin Gaethje versus Rafael Fiziev should be an absolute banger. My question is, when does the damage start to really show for Justin Gaethje? I remember years ago I did a profile of Gaethje for Fight Magazine, and I said, what's the one word for somebody that hasn't ever watched you fight or needs to know who you are as an athlete, as a competitor? What's the word that describes you? It may have actually been the first time I talked to him for UFC.com ahead of his debut. Get those two confused. I've been doing this for a long time. I'm old. And he said, damage. He said, carnage. That's the right word. Justin Gaethje is a walking demolition derby. He prides himself on being the most entertaining fighter in the UFC. And unfortunately, in this sport, entertaining means violent, punishing, putting yourself in harm's way. And he's put himself in harm's way a lot. And for the most part, he's done well, and he's come away on the right side of a lot of those punishing, damaging, grimy, gritty, bloody battles. But at some point, that has to start taking a toll. At some point, that starts piling up. And as you keep getting in there against these young, hungry cats like Fiziev, who are going to come out here and test you and happily going to say, you want to do this? You want to stand on each other's toes in the center of the cage and just bang this out? Let's go. I trust my defense. I trust my power. I trust my chin. Let's go, Justin Gaethje. At what point do we see his ability or his ability to take that kind of punishment start to wane the way that we saw Tony Ferguson's when Gaethje fought him on that first card back out of the pandemic? Right? For the longest time, the Tony Ferguson thing was he could just be in there and he's, indomitable. He's a juggernaut. He just keeps coming. He's a Terminator, and he fought Justin Gaethje, and Gaethje just kept banging on him over and over and over and over. And we got to the fifth round, and finally, mercifully, it was stopped. And it was clear at that point that Tony Ferguson was not the same fighter. There's going to come a time where that performance comes for Justin Gaethje, and I wonder if it's Saturday night in London. Next up in the welterweight division, Gunnar Nelson versus Bryan Barberena. My question here, maybe a controversial one, maybe one that people don't want to hear, but can we re-examine Gunnar Nelson's standing? So I will admit right here, right now, I am a Gunnar Nelson fan. I like the dude. Been high on him for his entire career. But here's where we are. Gunnar Nelson is 18-5-1 overall, 9-5-1 in the UFC, but just 5-5 over his last 10. And his best win is probably Albert Tumenov, who is one of those hardcore darlings that never really quite fully put it together in the UFC. Lots of people will say he deserves a second chance, probably the case, but it hasn't come to pass. And if it's not Albert Tumenov, it's Alex Oliveira, maybe Alan Jobin. Like, Gunnar Nelson has lost to the best fighters that he's faced, and he's never quite lived up to the level of hype and expectation that has followed him from the time he arrived in the UFC as an undefeated fighter. As I said, I love the guy. I love watching him compete. I think his grappling is terrific. I think there is a world beater in there somewhere. To me, it would probably be at 55 because he's a little undersized for fighting at 170, but he doesn't want to cut weight, and I respect the hell out of that. He's a bit of a tweener, though, for fighting at 170. I think he got rushed along a little bit too quickly in some of these matchups. Rick Story, Damian Maia specifically, that really kind of cost him. He's struggled with some injuries at times. He's struggled with just desire to compete, I think, at times. But he's one of those guys that the reputation to me sort of exceeds the performance that we've seen or the results that he's turned in. And so I'm really fascinated going into Saturday back in London, where he's a huge fan favorite. He's going to get one of the bigger pops of the night. And if you don't believe me, if you think I'm crazy, just watch on Saturday. He's going to get a bigger pop than some of these British athletes because he used to train in London and he's fought there a number of times. And there's a little bit of the Connor and Ireland connection. And he's just beloved in that city by these fans. He will get a big pop. But Bam Bam's a tough out. Bryan Barberena is a tough out who's coming off a disappointing performance against Rafael dos Anjos. He wants to get out there and avenge that and sort of get himself rolling again. Raised his hand for a lot of opportunities that came up. Finally got this one replacing Daniel Rodriguez. And I just want to see if Gunnar Nelson can kind of have a performance that makes me believe a little bit more in sort of the way we've always spoken about him. This to me would be the best win of his career if he picks it up. And at 35, I don't know if that's in the cards for him on Saturday. Move to the flyweight division, Jennifer Maia against King Casey O'Neill. My question is, will King Casey reclaim some momentum? So this time last year, or, a little bit later than this, a little bit sooner than this last year. So in February of last year, Casey O'Neill beats Roxanne Modafferi. It's a split decision that shouldn't have been a split decision. Whatever that judge was, whoever that judge was in Houston, crazy person, shouldn't ever judge fights again. And she's rolling, right? She's the one at the head of the list of ascending flyweights, young ascending flyweights. She's 4-0 in the UFC. She's undefeated overall. She's got a little bit of a personality. She's done well. It's her first decision, but there were finishes before that. All the pieces are falling into place. She's booked into a fight with Jessica Ai that feels like a little bit of a promotion into contention type of fight. Very winnable fight against Jessica Ai at that. And she blows out her knee in training camp and has spent the last basically year recovering, getting back, working her way back into shape, into health to be able to return this weekend. And in that time, Erin Blanchfield happened. Macy Barber put together some good wins. Natalia Silva came along. Miranda Maverick started having a few more good performances. Things changed a little bit. Alexa Grasso won the flyweight title, shook things up at the top of the division. And Casey O'Neill has had to watch that happen and lose some of that steam and that momentum and that push and that hype that she carried coming out of that win over Roxanne Modafferi. And I'm really curious, fighting somewhat close to her, where she was born in Scotland, raised in Australia, now trains in Vegas, lives and trains in Vegas, but still close to, I'm sure there are going to be friends and family in attendance for Casey O'Neill on Saturday. And I just want to see, can she come out and reclaim some of that, grab some of that back? She's not going to run past Erin Blanchfield with a win here. This Erin Blanchfield is now in the clubhouse and settled as the top young talent in this division, if not the whole of the UFC. I'm not having the conversation, at least about this division. Whole of the UFC we can talk about. There's a guy on here later that we'll have to include there. But this is the one where Casey O'Neill can again put herself into the title conversation, at least the picture, right? Jennifer Maia is that fighter now who, if you're good enough to be a contender, if you're good enough to be in that really upper tier of this division, you beat her. And if you're not, she beats you. Excuse me. It's a tough assignment off a year off. It's a tough assignment with full health. Jen Maia is a good fighter. She's sturdy. She's experienced. She can be dangerous in all facets. It's a good fight for Casey O'Neill. It's a good test to find out where she's at after a year away. And I want to see if she's able to set aside everything else that's happened in the division, all that desire to come back and make a statement, and just go out and put on a good performance, get her hand raised, keep moving in the right direction, and reclaim a little bit of that ground that she lost for being injured. Main card opens in the middleweight division, Marvin Vettori versus Roman Dolidze. And my question is, can Dolidze keep things rolling? From June of last year through till December, not even really December, through till October, Roman Dolidze won 3 fights, all by stoppage, collected 3 performance bonuses, and went from unranked guy that people weren't really thinking about in this division to a top 10 fighter who might be one of the few new, interesting, emerging names coming up at 185, which, as you know, if you watch this show or listen to Sean and I on the state of the UFC, is always desperately in need. And now this weekend, he gets one of those same guys in Marvin Vettori, who has been very good for the last 4 years, 5 years. The only losses are 2 to Israel Adesanya and 1 to Robert Whittaker. So there's no shame in if Roman Dolidze loses to Marvin Vettori on Saturday. The trouble is, we've seen everything with Marvin Vettori. He's sort of that things just stay the same option. And so Dolidze is a guy that has looked so good over these last fights, finishing Kyle Dawkins in the first round, finishing Phil Hawes in the first round, finishing Jack Hermanson in the second round, showcasing some of the grappling that a lot of people didn't know he had, but he has some serious, legitimate, credentialed pedigree grappling to then use that calf slicer to pin Jack Hermanson on the ground and pound out the finish from back mount, flattened him out. Harry must have been in love watching that finish, that sequence. Can he be a guy that goes out there and beats Marvin Vettori, who, as I said, has only lost to a pair of former champions and has beaten back everybody else? Can he go out there and get that victory, get a 5th straight win at middleweight to put himself in a situation where he's the guy now that's facing a Jared Cannonier or a Sean Strickland or maybe Robert Whittaker? Middleweight needs it, not to put any extra pressure on Dolidze, on the big burly Georgian. But middleweight could use a guy like Roman Dolidze. So we'll see what happens on Saturday. Move to the prelims for UFC 286. We kick it off at featherweight with Jack Shore versus Makwan Amirkhani. And my question here is simply, how does Shore look at featherweight? So last time out, he suffered his first loss ever. Never lost as an amateur, never lost through his climb up the ranks through Cage Warriors into the UFC until last time out against Ricky Simon, where he just got out athlete, he got out muscled, he got out stronged, all of those things. And now he's moving up a division. Now, in between there, he had a knee injury himself that he had to rehab and get better. And he's just one of these guys. I've been a big Jack Shore fan the whole way along. I love how technical he is. I love how cerebral he is. It's position and technique and mechanics over anything else. But I just wonder if you aren't able to necessarily carry that and translate that going up in weight as much as you could down at bantamweight, or like when you see people move down a division. Not that I'm advocating for him to move down or anything like that. Is it just a matter of he's now going to be facing bigger guys that some of them, many of them, probably Makwan Amirkhani as well, are going to still be better athletes, more explosive, more dynamic, bigger power. So where does he fit? Because for a long time at bantamweight, he felt to me like a guy that was going to be kind of a fixture in that 10 through 15 range, right? There was always going to be the shortcomings because of the athleticism or the comparative athleticism versus some of the opponents, as we saw with Ricky Simon. That set a good benchmark, a good baseline of this is the level that's going to always give Jack Shore trouble. How does that translate now that he goes up? How does that look now that he goes up in weight, up to 45, where it's still a bunch of talent, still a bunch of dangerous dudes? There's a bunch of Ricky Simons up at featherweight. I'm rooting for him. This is a winnable fight. This is a good matchup. Amirkhani will look to come out and wrestle. He's got about 5 minutes of gas in the tank most of the time. And so you're going to get an opportunity to A, get into your stuff early in terms of the grappling, in terms of the scrambles, in terms of the wrestling. And B, if you're not cutting weight and you're able to carry things more, you're going to have a chance to be the fresher fighter if we get into rounds 2 and 3. So this is a good starting point. And I'm just really curious to see what kind of reads we can make on Jack Shore in his debut at 45. Couple of lightweight fights back to back here. The first is Chris Duncan versus Omar Morales. And my question is, can Duncan be more than an all violence team member? Now, let's be clear here. Guys that are all violence team members, love them. Happy to have them. But it's not really the best course for your career. And so far, through 2 fights on the Contender Series and several fights in Cage Warriors, Chris Duncan is pretty much just we're going to see who falls over first. And that's going to be the end of this. Because 2 seasons ago on Contender Series, he got into a banger with Vyacheslav Borchov. And going toe-to-toe with Slava Claus, ended up that he was the one that got slept. And last time out, he goes toe-to-toe, somebody else, I believe Charlie Campbell. And it's not going great. And then he's the one that lands the telling blow and turns things around and gets the finish and gets a contract. And here he is against Omar Morales, who is going to come out there and give him every opportunity to throw hands, right? Omar Morales, more of a kicker, more of a kickboxer, likes to work from range. We saw him last time out against Uros Medic in a striking battle. So there's going to be opportunities. He's going to be fun. Like, let's be perfectly clear here. Having Chris Duncan on the roster for as long as it lasts, for as many fights as we get, is always going to be fun. He will feature in future 10 things I like columns and pieces where I just say Chris Duncan is fighting. Because watching this dude fight, and every time he steps in the cage, it is just carnage, to quote Justin Gaethje. But can he be more than that? Some guys don't want to be. Some guys aren't destined to be. We're going to find out. I want to find out as we progress through this UFC journey if he can be more than that. I'm not saying he has to be. I'm not saying he will be. Certainly happy to welcome him to the All Violence team, to the parenthetical insert name here is fighting crew. Continues to grow with each passing event with more and more new arrivals. But I just want to see if there's a little bit more than rock'em sock'em robots for Chris Duncan. Sticking at lightweight, two more debuting fighters, Sam Patterson versus Yanel Ashmoz. My question here is, what's reasonable to expect of these two? Admittedly, I don't know very much about either of these gentlemen. Patterson is 10-1-1, won 6 straight undefeated in his last 10, but it's against limited competition. He's bounced around through some promotions, a few stops in Brave. He too, like Duncan, won his contract on the Contender Series. He's a finisher overall, comes from Team Crossface, teammate of UFC commentator, and a conversation with veteran John Gooden. Ashmoz is 6-0. He's been fighting in good promotions on the East Coast of the United States, making a stop at Ring of Combat, CFFC, and the PFL Challenger Series. But similarly to Patterson, it has been very limited competition. And so both of these guys are just kind of really, truly at this level, complete unknowns with very uncertain, unsure futures. And for me, while I'm sure some people look at it and go, who are these guys? I don't care. I look at it and go, okay, I know a little bit about these guys. Let me learn more. And so Saturday night for me is about downloading information. It's about making reads. It's about seeing what these two men bring to the Octagon in their debuts, and then what we can build from that in terms of projections, in terms of expectations, in terms of ideas of where they can get to and who I would like to see them fight next, sort of thinking about the path they can take. These are the things I think about with fights like this and with athletes like this. And so I don't have any expectations for them going in. Kind of similar to a lot of young debuting fighters in the UFC. I try my absolute best to keep my expectations low and to a minimum so that I can just see who they are, see what the fight tells me, as Harry would say, and go from there. So I want to see these two guys get out there, see who gets their hand raised, see what they deliver, and we move forward from that. We move now to the flyweight division, Muhammad Mokaev against Jafel Filo. My question here is, will we see the dialed in Muhammad Mokaev? I mentioned earlier about Aaron Blanchfield being clearly the top young fighter in the UFC. Muhammad Mokaev would like to have a word with me for that, I'm sure. We spoke to Mo ahead of this fight. The interview, is up here on the channel. Please check that out. Very nice of him to drop by. Appreciate him sitting down with me for 15 minutes. I really liked the fact that in that fight, in that interview, he talked about the fight with Malcolm Gordon and said, look, I was playing to the crowd. I was very hyped up. I wanted to put on a show for them. And then in that second round, I have this Canadian veteran on my back, and suddenly I'm not in danger, but I'm having to deal with something that I really probably shouldn't. And that's the thing that Harry and I talked about coming out of that event on the takeaways. It's a thing I'm sure we're going to talk about on the preview show of just like, can Mokaev be dialed in at all times? Are we going to see a guy that takes this a little more seriously rather than banking just on his unreal gifts and skills and talents and abilities to eventually just figure it out, kind of take the easier path to get things done rather than be in there, make it harder than it needs to be for him. This is a fight against Jafel Filo that, if he is dialed in, this isn't close. Like, Muhammad Mokaev runs through this dude if he's dialed in. That's my assessment. I've seen Jafel Filo fight, watched his fight on the Contender Series, covered it for the website. He's fine, but he's not on Muhammad Mokaev's level. And if Mo's dialed in, he dominates. And so I'm really curious to see. I don't think it needs to be flashy and crazy and quick like his debut was a year ago against Cody Durden. But I think there's a path here where he can go out and make a statement by being just really clean. Go out there and just get into your wrestling right away. Put this guy on the ground, get him out of there, and then say, look, I had some fun last time out. It nearly cost me, but it didn't. I'm 4-0 in the UFC now. I'm still undefeated. I'm taking aim at John Jones's record for the youngest fighter to ever hold UFC gold. He's got until next March to do it. He said in that interview that I mentioned earlier that he wants to do it next year in London. He's got a chance to put himself kind of on a line to maybe get there. But a big statement on Saturday would certainly expedite things for Muhammad Mokaev. Move back to the featherweight division. Lerone Murphy returns against short notice replacement opponent Gabriel Santos, the former LFA champion, as I bash my mic. My question here is an unfortunate one. Has Lerone Murphy missed his window? So he's 11-0-1 overall, 4-0-1 in the UFC. He's won 4 straight since his debut draw with Zubara Tuhugov, who is a well-respected but frustrating, now no longer UFC fighter. But here's the thing. Murphy is 31. He's 32 in July. Hasn't fought since UFC 267. And it just sort of feels to me like as I was going through prepping this was the only question that came to mind for me, because I know the skills, I know the ability, I know the talent that's there. We've seen it with the wins over Ricardo Ramos, over Makwan Armakani. There's been good performances. The skills are there for this guy. But it just feels like he is right now a victim of his own inability to compete, right? They say in all these other sports that availability is a core ability. And he wasn't able to fight last year. And as such, the division just kept rolling along and a bunch of guys moved past him. And that doesn't change at any point. That doesn't slow down. So if you're not able to go out and put up 2-3 wins every year to keep clawing forward with everybody else that is, suddenly you end up taking 2-3 steps back just because of attrition through no fault of your own. The other unfortunate part here is he gets a replacement opponent in Gabriel Santos, who is a good fighter, but it's not Nathaniel Wood, which was the original fight, which was a fight that we were all excited to see because Nath has looked great since coming to the division, earning 2 wins. And it was going to be, I mean, you don't like the England against England, but it was going to be a great fight. It was going to be a real good measuring stick for each of those men. Nath gets hurt. He has to get pulled. We get Santos in here. So it limits the amount of momentum that Murphy can generate. It limits the amount of forward progress he can make in the eyes of a lot of people because Santos takes the fight on short notice, is a newcomer to the UFC. Yes, he won the LFA title, but that doesn't carry the same kind of weight for people these days as it did back in the past, even just 4 or 5 years ago, because we're getting so much turnover in a lot of these regional promotions, LFA included. It's great for them. They're graduating a lot of people to the UFC. They're showing that they are a very good pipeline to the biggest stages in the sport, not just the UFC. But it then sort of limits what you're able to glean and what you're able to understand about these men and women that hold titles in these promotions and how much you can really credit or bank on value for a win for a guy like Lerone Murphy here. And so chances are he's not back before the summer, which means he's 32 in a division where there's a whole bunch of really young up and comers that have already passed him in the queue the Ilya Tapurias, the Bryce Mitchells, the Arnold Allens that have already, just the Movsar Evloyevs, that have already raced past him. So how does he make up that ground? I don't know that he can. A big performance on Saturday certainly puts him back in the conversation. It is going to be a reminder to everybody of how good he is should he achieve that result this weekend. But I just wonder if he's one of those guys that the timing of things, the way everything is played out, the way everything has shook out for him, he's just unfortunately missed his shot. Move to the middleweight division. Christian Leroy Duncan making his UFC debut against Duško Todorovic. My question is, can Duncan be a guy at middleweight? Here we are. It is the weekly installment of Can Person X be a guy at middleweight? And I tell you what, I'm intrigued, but I'm doing my absolute level best not to get excited because middleweight is heartbreaking. Middleweight has a horrible history, and I just don't want to allow myself to get my hopes up. But here's Christian Leroy Duncan, 7-0, Cage Warriors champ, 27 years old, turns 28 in July. So lots of years left, still just scratching the surface of the athletic prime. Trains under Mark Weir, UFC veteran. He's dynamic. He's a finisher. He's looked very, very good of late. Should look good on Saturday. Todorovic is a guy that you can get out of there, that you can put out. We've seen that a few times. It feels like there's room, right? We spoke about it earlier. Middleweight is one of these positions. As I mentioned with Delide, middleweight is a division where you get a couple good wins. You build a little bit of momentum. There is room for forward growth, forward progress relatively quickly compared to a lot of these divisions. And to have a 27, 28-year-old Englishman that can maybe move forward and progress through the ranks will be a great thing for the UFC. I'm trying not to get my hopes up. I'm trying not to say too much. I need there to be a guy at middleweight sometime soon. It's so stale. It's maybe not as bad as light heavyweight, as Harry and I discussed on the takeaways this week, but it's still pretty bad. I don't want to say Christian Leroy Duncan, you're our only hope, Obi-Wan Kenobi style, but we're getting close. So hopefully it goes well. Hopefully things translate from the Cage Warriors cage to the Octagon on Saturday. Back to flyweight, Malcolm Gordon versus Jake Hadley. My question here is, will Hadley make a statement? So this is a really interesting matchup for me. And maybe this is me overthinking it. Maybe I'm somebody that kind of wants to read too much into too many different things. But Jake Hadley is facing Malcolm Gordon, who fought Muhammad Mokaev last time out and had a little bit of success. Mo downplayed it, as I said in the interview, of like, I was never in trouble. But look, you spent a round with Malcolm Gordon on your back and you had to get a finish in the third round, went out and got it. That was fine. Not had to in the sense of like, if you didn't, you lose the fight because Mokaev won the first round. But it was even going into the third round. And so here comes Jake Hadley, who prior to his UFC debut was chest out, full of confidence, flipping the birds, white Kong, whole 9 yards. And then he gets humbled a little bit by Alan Nascimento. And he comes back in his sophomore appearance and he dominates Carlos Candelario. Looks great. And Saturday, to me, feels like a chance for Hadley to come out and say, listen, Mokaev isn't the only guy from over here that can make some waves, that can do some stuff on the ground that people should be paying attention to. And if he goes out and he runs through Malcolm Gordon, if he goes out and he beats Malcolm Gordon quicker than Mokaev did, more dominantly, cleaner than Mokaev did, I wouldn't be surprised to see him get on the mic and say a little something about Mokaev. Try to angle for that fight. Now, I don't think it happens. I think the UFC sees them at two different tiers right now. And Mokaev is, pretty close to getting the jetpack strapped to his back. And Jake Hadley is getting a little bit of a slower play because he had some issues on the Contender Series that Dana White talked about. He lost the debut, so he's got a little bit of ground to make up. But this feels like a little bit of a chance for him to get all up and get that chest puffed out again and get feeling pretty good about himself again in comparison to a tremendous prospect in the division, and just sort of show like he can have the spotlight, but don't forget about me. I just did better against this guy than he did 7-8 months ago. We go back to the flyweight division for the women. Joanne Wood returns against Luana Carolina. And my question is, what does Wood have left in the tank? This is, as always, not a desire to usher people out of the octagon. It's never a testimony or statement about fighters being done, fighters being whatever. I'm happy to see Joanne Wood back. I love JoJo. Anytime you get her around and you can put a microphone in front of her and she can hit you with that very soft, sweet voice, I'm in. But from a competitor standpoint, from an athlete standpoint, she is 37 now. She's lost 3 straight. She's lost 4 of 5, 5 of 7, and is just 7-8 in the UFC. So for somebody that came into that Ultimate Fighter tournament as, I believe, the 3 seed, somebody that I thought had a very good chance of winning that competition, to then get into the UFC and be 7-8 overall, feels like a disappointment. She's been out for basically a year, hasn't fought since losing to Alexa Grasso, now champion. Historically, this is the level of fighter she beats, right? Luana Carolina hasn't fought since this time last year when she got knocked unconscious by Molly McCann and that spinning elbow that launched Molly into the stratosphere for a little bit of hype and popularity and whatever, and Patty's coattails and yada, yada, yada. That was derailed by Aaron Blanchfield. The good performances, though, have just been few and far between. Like, it's one thing to beat Luana Carolina, and I don't know what that would tell us about Joanne Wood at this point. Like, is this come back and get one relatively close to home and say, thank you, I'm now going to go and be a mom and be a wife and train people at the gym and move into some coaching and things like that? Is this a little bit of the Jim Miller where, look, I just want to compete. I want to take a step back. I know I can't compete against the very best of this division, but I still want to be out here. I want to be active. I still enjoy being in the gym. So let me get in here with the Luana Carolinas of the world. Would absolutely be for it. But I need to see a performance. I need to see a little bit of that fire, a little bit of that want to be in there, a little bit of that aggressiveness that we haven't really seen in the last couple of fights. So I'm very curious to see what JoJo brings to the cage on Saturday. 2 left, lightweight division, Jai Herbert versus Ludovic Klein. My question here is, can Herbert finally shine against the striker? It's been a rough go for Jai Herbert in the UFC. He's coming off a win, though. He's coming off a victory over Kyle Nelson. Last time the UFC was in London. It's a good win. It's a solid win over a grimy Canadian veteran in the monster, Kyle Nelson. Now he gets a guy that's going to stand with him in Ludovic Klein. And look, this is one of those fights where they're going to go out there. Jai's going to have opportunities to strike. He should have opportunities to get loose, to get comfortable. We've seen him training on the embedded program, Team Renegade with Leon Edwards, with that crew, getting locked in for this opportunity. We've talked for years and talked certainly on this platform about Jai Herbert being much better than the results indicate in the UFC. I still hold that to be true. But this is one of those fights where you got to show it. If you're ever going to show it, this is it. Because this is a guy that's going to strike with you. It's a guy that's going to go out here, give you every opportunity to do things the way you want. Can you do it? Can you shine? Can you show us something? Can you tap into that stuff that made us so excited about you coming over to the UFC, leaving the Cage Warriors belt behind, coming over, getting into the Octagon? Or is it another sort of middling, okay, not great performance? Like some of the other ones we've seen, like the Francisco Trinaldo fight. And I don't mean from the finish standpoint, but I mean from just like the overall performance. This is an important fight for Jai Herbert. I want him to have a moment in the UFC, and for it to be in London would be the best. The Kyle Nelson win isn't a moment. It's a grimy, gritty, deep exhale, I got my hand raised kind of fight. This is the chance for Jai Herbert to have a moment. I want to see if he can. Last one, Juliana Miller versus Veronica Hardy. My question here is, what will each of these women show us? So Juju Miller won the Ultimate Fighter last season, season 30, by defeating Brogan Walker in the finale, got a stoppage late in that fight as part of the card in September where every fight was a finish. She's 3-1 overall. She showed some growth and development and grit through the house into that finale performance. She's 26. She's just a young kid that hasn't had a lot of experience. On the flip side of things, Veronica Hardy, formerly Veronica Macedo, married Dan Hardy on Christmas. Congratulations, you two. Is 1-4 in the UFC, which is her last 5 fights, but she's still only 27. And so with both of these athletes, it's for me a question of like, okay, what for Juju, it's what have you learned and what have you developed and continued to grow since winning the Ultimate Fighter? And for Hardy, who hasn't fought in a couple of years now, what have you developed? What new wrinkles have you added? What have you figured out in this last year that makes you want to come back, that makes you want to continue to pursue this, that should make us think that things have changed for you, that you're not just this fighter that can't compete and thus far hasn't been able to hang at this level, albeit against bigger fighters or maybe in the wrong weight class, whatever the case may be. But what are we going to see here from each of them? This isn't just a one-way thing. This is each of them. Similar to the Sam Patterson, Yanel Ashmoz fight. It's hard to make reads on either of these women. A little bit more on Hardy. It's a little easier on Hardy because we've had 5 UFC fights and thus far that tape isn't good. But you want to give her a little bit of the benefit of the doubt because she was super young. She's a little bit older now, a little bit more developed now in terms of her skill, you would think. So let's just see. This is a take it all in, see what the fight gives me, see what these athletes give me, and go from there kind of situation. This is a really interesting card. It's certainly not as loaded as UFC 285 was just a couple weeks ago. Kind of what happens when you're running this many pay-per-views. This is already our 4th pay-per-view. We're not even out of March yet, and we've got big ones on the horizon. But it's a good card. This main event is a fascinating fight. The co-main event should be an absolute banger. There's cool stuff throughout it. I will be back tomorrow with 10 things. Myself, Harry, and Sean will be here for the preview show as well. We may get an appearance from Ian O'Neill popping in from Ireland from vacation, but I don't want to guarantee that. We always welcome you, especially if you've had a couple of pints and have a couple of things to say. I do want to thank you all for tuning in, for checking this out, for enjoying this show, this program, this series, all of this stuff I do. Thinking about making some changes here in the next couple of weeks in terms of the amount of content that I'm putting out. I would love to hear from you about whether you want to see this show and 10 Things continue. They're the two that kind of feel like there's room to maybe move them around or do them a little bit more sporadically, save them maybe just for pay-per-view weeks. So please hit us up in the comments, hit me up on Twitter or on Instagram at Spencer Kyte, and let me know your thoughts. I appreciate you. I love you. I hope you're looking forward to these fights. I am. We'll see you tomorrow.